Meow 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 meow. Yo. Okay, let me put the live chat on. Meow meow. You know, I think... Okay, so... For the longest time, I've been using Google Chrome for the live chat. And I'm wondering if I should try switching over to Firefox. You know, the reason being I'd like to check if it would work better if it doesn't like spike. If it doesn't spike whenever I open it, or you know, along the way. If it doesn't spike with the Ethernet, the GPU and the CPU. You know, those can be the reasons why the stream gets disconnected or degrades in quality or performance. Someone saw someone sending emojis. Who's there? Hello. Anyway, you know, actually my clothes are in the dryer. So I'm gonna hang them after the stream. So one thing I bought, I don't know, 20 pieces of hangers last time. I'm guessing is that your Rafik with emojis? You're the one who usually does that. Anyway, yeah, I don't know why I have a headache right now. Yeah, it's you. Right now I have a headache. I did cook some macaroni. And I ate chicken with rice.
Anyone need a health checkup?
So I don't know why I have a headache right now. It's probably because my sleep wasn't so good. I don't even know how much sleep I got. Because I don't really count the hours anymore. And you know, I checked my Twitter profile today. There hasn't been any freaking update. It's like you know, sometimes I think they're not doing their job of checking my submissions. So what have you been doing? Oh, there's a bad news. You're from Malaysia, right? Yeah, May 24, so just yesterday. Or 25. So what happened was a Malaysian national died because because a structure collapsed. A Malaysian person died here in the Philippines. When
Tatlo na ang nasawi
two construction workers
sa mga na-recover na biktima ng pagguho ng isang under construction na gusali sa Angeles, Pampanga. Hamon sa mga otoridad ang mano-manong pagtatanggal ng debris para mahanap ang 17 iba pang nawawala. Ang mainit na balita hatid
damn.
Walang
araw.
pito ang biktima sa pagguho ng gusali. Mag-aalas 3 ng madaling araw kahapon.
You know, this is why I always wore a whistle on my ID lanyard. So that if I ever get trapped under the rubble, blowing on the whistle is less tiring than, whatever. I think 17 people were missing. Anyway, what am I gonna grind today? What am I gonna grind? Energy recharge, wow. I guess I'm gonna grind for Lisa. And then, I think I'm gonna have to order more fabric softener. Fabric softener. I'm gonna buy the 25 kilograms of 25 kilograms of detergent. The freak is off.
Is there time for a quick snack?
I think I just wanna chill tonight, so I'm not gonna play Dota, of course. That's freaking stressful. Maybe I'll play Warhammer. It's pretty boring, I know. It's pretty boring for viewers. I mean, I don't know.
I got you, boss.
Oh, why do I have a headache? Oh yeah, I haven't even gotten the multivitamins. You know, I was rambling about it. In the previous weeks. And for that one, I'm not gonna have it delivered. I'm gonna go to a generic drugstore to get those.
You really know how to get me going.
I really feel like I don't wanna play Battlefield anymore. It's, after a lot of grinding on Isonzo, I hate how many times I have to hit people in Battlefield before they go down.
Here to play with me. Let me amuse myself a little.
I think I saw a post somewhere on social media, I forgot where. Of course, it was about AI again. I think specifically AI and students. I mean, if people don't wanna study anymore, if they're just gonna rely on AI, I said that. I already said that before. Why would an employer pick you over AI? Okay, before I get any of this, I gotta check my budget first. As a rule of thumb, I don't really like to spend back when I was doing buy and sell, I would limit my purchases to 2,000 pesos. It's because that's the limit. That was the purchase limit for Grab for the cash on delivery. And that carried over. Even when I didn't I didn't have to follow that rule anymore. I still had that behavior. Cap it on 2,000 pesos. Yeah, I think I really need multivitamins. But for now, I'm just gonna take vitamin C. Because that's what I have. Oh no, I did the wrong character. Hello. Meow meow meow. I'm doing well, thanks for asking. I'm pretty bummed. Pretty bummed when my tentative work. There isn't any progress today. There wasn't any progress. Later I'll check again. After the stream. What was I gonna do? No, not blacksmith. Am I really gonna? I feel like I'm using the wrong set. Pretty bad. Shit. I don't really have a headache. Just a bad headache. You know, but on the plus side, the acne on my face aren't very big. And they got smaller yesterday. Excuse me. Man, I freaking grinded Lisa. I'm so indecisive. I hope this works. Oh, so anyway, yesterday we were listening to scary stories. And earlier today I was watching how I was trying to look for how Conor McGregor made fun of Islam before their fight with I think Kamzat. But I can't find that part. No, not Kamzat. Kabim. What? Hold on, am I gonna listen to Mr. Balin today? Or Mr. Nightmare?
You know, coffee spikes your cortisol.
Yeah, but it's good for your liver.
Pro tip, magnetic hydration.
Now what's your
Punishment. I swear it's for medical research.
This happened to me about 2 years ago when I was driving home from New York down to Tennessee to visit one of my friends from college. I made the trip alone because I actually like driving long distance by myself. I usually just listen to podcasts or music the whole way and stop whenever I feel tired. I left early in the morning, thinking I could probably make the whole drive in one stop, but by the time it got late, I realized I was way too exhausted to safely keep driving.
use the force officer?
It was around 1 in the morning at that point, and I was somewhere in Virginia off a highway I don't remember anymore.
Cut to the
I
chase.
pulled off at one of those blue sign exits that only has a gas station, a food place, and a couple old motels. I chose the cheapest motel because I honestly just needed somewhere to sleep for a few hours. The place looked pretty rough from the outside. It was one of those two-floor motels where every room faces the parking lot. You know, a motel from every scary movie ever.
Judgment.
Half the lights outside were out, and there were barely any cars there. Slow night, I guess. I almost left and found another place, but I was so tired. Honestly, I was looking for a bed, not some glamorous resort.
You can't run.
The front office was behind thick glass, even though it was open. The guy working there looked like he was in his 50s. He barely even looked up when I walked in. I paid for the room, got my key card, and asked if they had any vacancies. He said most of the rooms upstairs were empty. I remember that because it made me feel a little better knowing there wouldn't be people making noise all night. Oh boy, the irony of that. My room was on the second floor near the far end of the building. The room was old-fashioned, but for the money, that was expected. There was a weird smell to be expected in an old hotel or motel. The room was humid as hell, but the AC made such a horrible rattling noise that I just left it off. I honestly considered just sleeping in my car instead, but I was already there and too tired to care anymore. I locked the door, shut the blinds. I took a shower and laid down on the bed with the TV on low volume. I was in bed for around 20 minutes before I started hearing them arguing next door. It sounded like a couple fighting. Great. The walls were thin enough that I could hear muffled voices, but not clearly enough to make out full sentences. I was annoyed because I thought it was going to keep me awake all night. One voice sounded deeper and angry, while the other sounded softer. The weird thing was the softer voice didn't sound female exactly. It sounded like someone related to a woman's voice. Obvious higher-pitched voice coming from a man. The argument kept going back and forth for a while. One voice would get loud and aggressive, and then the other would respond sounding serious, and then the other would respond sounding nervous. I started noticing something strange, though. The timing between the voices felt suspiciously perfect. There was never any overlap, like in basically any real fight. Each voice waited perfectly for the other to finish. I turned my TV volume down and sat there listening closer. That's when it hit me, that it was one guy doing both voices. Once I realized, I couldn't unhear it. The deeper voice sounded natural, but the softer voice sounded like the same man trying to imitate somebody else, I guess a female. I remember feeling this weird pit in my stomach, because it suddenly changed the entire situation from an annoying argument to something seriously disturbing. No matter how I tried to explain it away or rationalize it, I would realize it just didn't make any sense. The so-called argument kept going for another few minutes before suddenly stopping completely for there to just be silence. I remember laying there, staring at the ceiling, hoping maybe the guy had finally gotten tired of whatever the hell he was doing. And I heard a few slow knocks on the wall beside my bed. Fists hitting the wall as he knocked on the door. My head shot to the left. Then I heard this muffled voice through the wall saying, "Are you in there?" I held my breath. And the guy knocked again and said the same thing again, that he was waiting for acknowledgement. He was trying to do some creepy, playful voice, like he found something funny. I wasn't having any of this. I grabbed the remote and turned the TV volume up, trying to drown him out. For maybe 30 seconds, there was no sound at all. Then I heard the vibration of a door opening outside. Hearing that instantly made my heart start racing because I knew he had left his room. I muted the TV and listened carefully. I could feel the vibration of footsteps on the balcony outside approach my room. My blinds were fully shut, except for a tiny crack near the edge where they didn't fully meet the wall. I kept staring at that crack, wondering if I should look or not. Part of me thought I was just making the situation scarier in my head than it actually was. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I walked slowly to the window and pulled the blinds apart just enough to see outside. The second I looked through, I saw a man standing right outside my window trying to look in.
Imagine calm, hydrated skin with no redness. Celemax Noni Ampoule. Repair and hydrate in one step. Lazada. 100% authenticity guaranteed. Free shipping included. Tap the link now.
Don't blink. Speed of light.
His face was... The second I looked through, I saw a man standing right outside my window trying to look in. His face was so close to the glass that it made me jump backward immediately. He definitely made eye contact for a split second. His eyes looked wide open. The second I moved away from the window, he started making these weird voices outside. I promise this when I say he sounded like he was imitating characters. I don't know what characters.
He was imitating Nik Vtuber. Me. Just kidding.
But he was having a whole creepy voice acting practice outside
Shit.
my motel room door. Then he started knocking on my door while changing his voice over and over. 1 second he sounded high-pitched and childish, and suddenly deep and angry. I remember one of the voices sounding like an exaggerated southern accent. It would have sounded ridiculous and maybe even funny in any normal situation, but hearing it outside my motel room at nearly 2 in the morning terrified me. This was obviously a sick, mentally ill person. The knocking kept getting harder. Not enough to break the door down, enough that I thought the whole motel could hear it. I called the front office immediately and told the guy that somebody outside my room was acting insane and wouldn't leave me alone. The guy sounded irritated at first until he probably heard the banging through the phone. Then his tone changed and he said he'd come up right away. The guy outside kept switching voices and knocking for another minute or two. Then suddenly it stopped completely. I looked through the peephole and saw him speed walking back into the room beside mine. A few seconds later, the motel worker came upstairs carrying a flashlight and his other hand on his holster. He knocked on the door next to mine after seeing the guy speed off into that room.
Well, I'm glad they have armed security. Or, armed staff.
And he started trying to talk to the guy inside. I couldn't hear everything clearly, but he kept asking him to open the door. There was no answer at all from inside. The worker stood there for maybe a minute before finally coming over to me. I opened the door and explained everything that happened. The worker hesitated for a second before saying the guy had been staying there for a while. That answer alone made me want to leave immediately. I asked if I could switch rooms, and he said yes. He moved me to a room downstairs near the front office, right by my car. I grabbed my few belongings as fast as possible and followed him down there. The new room was basically identical to the first one, except not next to a mentally ill person. I remember feeling relieved once I locked myself inside, because I figured there was no way the guy would bother me again after management got involved. I turned the TV on quietly and sat awake for a while, replaying the whole thing in my head. Eventually, exhaustion caught up to me, and I started drifting off. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up again, but it was still dark outside. What woke me up was the sound of someone outside the room. I looked toward the window and saw a shadow move past the crack in the blinds. Then a few seconds later, it passed again. Not this again. I carefully moved closer to the window without making noise and looked through the crack. It was the same guy from upstairs. He was creepily walking past my room over and over again. The weird part was he wasn't making voices anymore. He wasn't knocking either.
What's an explanation anomaly? What's that?
He just kept walking by while looking toward the room every time he passed. I remember feeling even more uncomfortable because now he seemed calm. I watched him do this maybe 4 or 5 times before he eventually disappeared toward the back of the motel. I didn't sleep again after that. The second the sun started coming up, I packed all my stuff, threw it in the car, and left without even returning the key card. I stopped at a gas station down the road for coffee and realized my hands were still shaking. People are weird and downright dangerous. Staying at a creepy motel is perhaps how to do a speed run of meeting those people. I will not stay at one again. So just to preface, this happened in 2022 when I was a freshman in college. I'm from Central Texas and went to Texas State University. My family had to come pick me up from my dorm during spring break so we could go on a road trip to Oklahoma. Why Oklahoma? Well, there's a lot of Native American history there, and my stepmom has some Native American ancestry. Anyway, we spent some time in Oklahoma before deciding we were kind of bored there, so we drove to Branson. This road trip was only us girls, so my dad did not come with us. It was me, my 3 sisters, my stepmom, and my grandma. Once we finished up in Branson and the week-long break was coming to an end, we started our drive back to my college. The drive obviously couldn't be done in one night alone, so around 8 p.m., we decided to stop at a random motel on the side of the highway to get some sleep.
Yeah, no, I like these because, they're dealing with people, not, supernatural or paranormal.
We checked in and paid, but before settling
Oh
in...
my god, it's the anime. It's the anime apartment. Just like a rent-a-girlfriend.
We decided to get some pizza. Before leaving, we dropped our stuff off in our rooms. My grandma called us asking what the room number was so she could change real fast. We were standing in the lobby when she called, and my sister told her the room number out loud. That's when I noticed this man just standing at the entrance of the building. I'm very hyper aware of things because I'm scared of everything, so I always scan around and make sure nothing feels out of the ordinary. This man was wearing a black knitted sweater and black pants. I asked my sister why she thought he was standing there like that without doing anything. She brushed it off, but I didn't. At that point, I started getting even more nervous because I realized she had just said our room number out loud while this man could clearly hear her since the motel wasn't very big at all. We had to walk past him to leave, and when we did, I made...
Yeah, I watched the first season. I stopped watching because they changed the OP. The OP is my favorite part of it. The OP and of course Sarashina Roka. Hold on.
Made eye contact with him that still sends shivers down my spine to this day, but that was it for the moment. We came back around 10 or 11 p.m. By then, we were exhausted from driving all day.
What the frick? Look at this. I think this is AI. There's a monitor, but I don't think there's enough room for a keyboard and mouse. And then there's a vending machine right beside it.
And just wanted to sleep. Me and my two sisters walked into the motel while my other sister, stepmom, and grandma stayed outside getting things from the car. When we walked in, I saw that guy again. This time, he was sitting in the far back corner of the lobby where there were TVs. That whole section was dark with no lights on. He was just sitting there doing nothing. That freaked me out even more. To make things worse, my grandma called again asking for the room number, and once again, my sister said it out loud right in front of the man. I started walking a little faster and noticed the man was now on his phone talking to someone. I couldn't hear what he was saying because he was whispering. We went up to the second floor where our rooms were. Two of my sisters were in one room, and my other sister, stepmom, and grandma were in another room.
Are you trying to extract ancient DNA the wrong way? Are your tools lacking what it takes to get the job done? Are you at your wit's end and just trying...
The rooms weren't directly next to each other. There was one room separating them.
Hi, good morning.
We went into our room, and everything seemed fine for a little while. We were just laying on our phones getting ready for bed. Maybe 20 minutes later, we heard a knock on the door. I had already been telling my sisters how scared I was, so this immediately freaked me out because I thought it was that creepy man from downstairs. Thankfully, it was my stepmom. The second we opened the door, she rushed inside. That instantly triggered alarm bells in my head. I asked her what happened. She told us to start packing immediately, and I could tell she was dead serious. So we started packing. While we were packing, she explained that she had opened her door to put some trash outside and was suddenly face to face with a man standing silently against the wall right beside the door. When she opened it, he didn't even look surprised. He just stared at her for a second. Then she said the worst part. After staring at her, he calmly walked into the room separating our two rooms. That completely sent me over the edge. We all started leaving the motel while my stepmom went to the front desk to ask for a refund. Surprisingly, they actually gave her one after she explained the situation. After that, we walked outside, only to see the same guy stepping out of the elevator and heading back into the lobby. Once outside, we noticed another man who looked like he was trying to break into cars, And when I say that, I mean it. He had his hands cupped against windows looking inside, pulling on door handles and jiggling them, trying to open the doors. I was so shocked by everything happening that I caught myself just standing there frozen. I guess we were being kind of loud because he suddenly looked over at us while we were getting into the car. He then looked toward the motel entrance and motioned his head like he was signaling someone to come outside. Thank God by then we had all gotten into the car already because I watched all of this happen from the window. The first creepy guy I had noticed earlier walked outside and started talking
Man. No, that's scary.
to the other men while they kept looking over at our car. We still hadn't driven away yet because my stepmom had called my dad to explain what was happening. And honestly, we didn't even know where to go at that point or who would take us in that late at night. Then a third man appeared. At that point, there were now 3 men slowly walking toward our car. I begged my stepmom to start driving. I guess she was panicking and didn't know what to do because everyone in the car was yelling at her to go. We finally sped off and kept driving until around 3 a.m. before finding another motel to stay at. That motel had roaches, but honestly, I'd take roaches over what we just escaped from. I still don't know what those men were planning to do, or if they even had a plan at all. But based on the way that first man acted all night, I'm incredibly glad we left before finding out.
On my oath, they die.
So if you've never stayed at a motel, they're basically a hotel's smaller, broker
Twilight.
little cousin. Compared to a hotel, they're usually completely bare bones. You just get a bed to sleep on, a bathroom, and that's it. But that's the beauty of them sometimes if you don't want to spend hotel dollars. I feel like the 2 times you book a motel are when you're on a road trip, or if you're on a long vacation and want to offset the costs for a hotel with a motel for part of the trip. So my girlfriend Julie and I were the first example. We were driving down to Florida, which is a 17-hour drive for us. I insisted on driving all the way through or just sleeping in the car, but she didn't want to do that, understandably. When we were about 11 hours into the drive, it was dark, late, and I was feeling that feeling of struggling to keep my eyes open. We had already pinned a motel on the map half an hour earlier that Julie found. It was about a half mile off the highway. Julie was already asleep. I would wake her up when we got to the motel. Julie already booked us a reservation for the motel. Seeing 2 minutes left on the screen was a huge relief. It pulled us off the highway and eventually into the parking lot of the motel. It was kind of dead in there. I think there was one other car, and honestly, it could have been the front office employees. I woke Julie up, and I told her I'm going to check us in. I went to the little front office, and there was a woman sitting in there. She looked tired and disheveled, but she still gave me a smile and greeted me. I think she was sleeping, but then got up and went to the office to greet us for the reservation. She gave me the key and told me the room number, room 5. It was the far corner on the ground level. Julie and I brought our small bags into the room. It was a basic motel room. We took turns in the bathroom brushing our teeth and whatever. When I went through my bag and realized my phone charger was still in the car, I got up and told Julie I'd be right back. She just gave me a little grunt like she was too tired and saying a word would use up too much energy. I opened the door and left it cracked open. I walked over to the car and pressed the button on the key fob to unlock it. The lights lit up, and I think that's when I noticed the lights in the front office were off. The lady went back to sleep, I guess. Maybe that car was hers and she lives on the property. Wouldn't surprise me. But now, the place was completely dark. It was a little eerie. Not even any traffic on the road. As I got to my car, I dug around looking for my charger. I have the new iPhone with the USB-C port. Julie has the old one, and she always likes to unplug my phone so she could connect to CarPlay. So I took a minute looking for it till I found it in the center compartment. I guess she put it there. I closed the door, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw someone right by the door to our room. It was a man. I left the door cracked open just as a subconscious habit so I wouldn't get locked out, even if they weren't automatic locking doors. I jogged over to make it clear I was there before this man entered the room or something weird. I have to admit, this man was large. Not just tall, but big frame too. He had on a long trench coat that did not fit the mildly chilly weather. As I got close to the door, it really looked like he was planning on opening the door. When he heard me coming, he turned around. The man from the start smiled and had a very soft demeanor. The way he spoke was so soft that instead of being calming, it was off-putting. He asked me how I was doing tonight. Mind you, it was like past 1 a.m. I could read something weird in his intentions with his small talk, so I deflected it and skipped to the important question, if there even was one, which was, what are you doing walking around so late? Are you staying here? He shot back his answer quickly in the same soft voice, saying, oh, I'm staying upstairs, just going for a stroll. I nodded, and he smiled back and said, well, enjoy your walk, have a good night. He smiled and nodded, and then I went inside and shut the door. I was pretty quick to lock it.
When playing games on PC, do you ever wonder if someone had a clip with you in it?
Download Metal, then go to Albums, clips are in.
Julie was in bed already, snoring. She sleeps like a baby. Otherwise, I would have been talking to her about how weird that encounter just was. I stood by the door with my ear up to it. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to hear footsteps walking away or not. All I know is, I didn't. Was he still standing there? I was scared to know, but I had to. I got on my knees, literally, and crawled over to the window, and very delicately moved the curtain a bit to the side, just enough at an angle to see in front of the door of the room. He was there. He was actually standing in front of our motel room door as if he was just staring at it. I lay on the floor like that for 10 minutes. He wouldn't move. It was like I was having a staring contest with him, and he was having a staring contest with our door. I eventually said this and crawled over to the bed. When I got into the bed, I shook Julie awake but told her to be quiet. She was groggy until I explained everything about that encounter and that he's still outside the door. I didn't want to scare her, but I also didn't want to be alone with this situation, and I knew she wouldn't believe me if I didn't tell her. I whispered at her to go crawl to the window and look out it. She said I was scaring her to stop, but I begged her to go look so she'd believe me. She gave in and got on her knees and crawled to the window where I moved the curtain. She looked out to the door and said, he's not there. I said, look harder, are you sure? And then she gasped, if not shrieked. She got up and ran back to the bed. I honestly panicked and said, what is it? What did you see? She replied to me to go look out the window at the rooms across the parking lot. I crawled back to the window and looked around, and I saw it very quickly. The guy in the trench coat was across the parking lot. He was standing still, but still facing our room. Actually, he was facing the window. I know it. Like he saw me watching him. I looked for 30 seconds and he didn't move. I yanked the curtain shut. I told Julie I'm freaking the f*** out. I grabbed a blunt object just to keep by the bed secretly. I didn't want Julie seeing that and realizing I was expecting things to get physical. We waited in the bed for like an hour, and at some point in that time, we thought we heard footsteps walk by outside, but we couldn't be sure. All I know is we both agreed we heard something outside by the window. The terrifying thought that he was outside our window the entire time was actually sick. Part of me just sensed it, that he was right outside. It was so late at this point, and we were so shot from the drive that I think we just faded away without realizing it. We woke up the next morning, actually relieved we made it through the night. We put our stuff in the car, and I went to the front desk. The same lady was there. I think she owned the place. I returned the key and told her about the man in the trench coat, and how he was creepily walking around and then standing outside our door for 10 minutes. The woman looked scared and surprised when I told her this. She said she knew of no such man. She also said we were the only guests that night. When I asked, she said she had no cameras either. Julie and I thanked the woman, and we got the f*** out of there. I almost felt bad for that woman, leaving her there alone. But honestly, Julie and I didn't want to be there another second. It was just an extremely strange night. A once-in-a-lifetime creepy experience that we'll forever tell at gatherings.
Excuse me. I think I wanna listen to Mr. Ballen again. You know, I kinda miss the time when I'd always be listening to him, actually waiting for his next video. But let's see. I've forgotten what we... I forgot.
Today's three-story show that no matter how harmless and trustworthy a person might look, you have no idea who they really are beneath the surface until it's too late. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice homemade cherry pie. But don't tell them you didn't remove the pits. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of May 25th, 2023, a student named Jung Yoo-jung sat at her desk in her bedroom inside the house where she lived with her grandfather in Busan, which is the second largest city in South Korea. Jung was hunched over with her head in a book. Chaeun told Jaehyun said, yeah, of course.
I think we listened to this yesterday.
As the suitcase, but now it's plainly obvious that the suitcase is empty, or whatever was really anything she was saying. And at that moment, the woman's world came crashing down, because she knew that despite all the months of studying she had done, she had just failed her test. It would turn out that Jung Yoo-jung was not a 9th grade student studying for an English exam. She was actually a 23-year-old woman masquerading as a high schooler. And her very important test was one she had actually created for herself. She wanted to see if she could commit the perfect murder.
Yeah, we listen to this. The night shift.
Imagine redness calmed in seconds. Skin 1004 centellipads. Fast calming and hydration. Lazada 100% authenticity guaranteed. Free shipping included. Tap the link now.
Today, we have 2 stories about people who have near-death experiences. And then after the initial trauma of the experience has passed, they're like, okay, I'm good now, I'm safe, everything's fine. But no, they were not okay, as they would soon learn. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house, and on their bathroom mirror, write, I'm watching you in red lipstick. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of April 29th, 1963, a woman named Sofia Perez was riding in the passenger seat of her car, her husband Julian was driving, and they were traveling down a narrow city street in Sevilla, Spain. It was a Monday, but Julian, who was the primary breadwinner, he didn't have work that day. And so the couple had decided, since it was such a beautiful spring day as well, that they would get out and go on a nice drive and just spend some time together. And for Sofia, I mean, this was like a perfect day. She adored her husband, and she really loved the city of Sevilla. You know, all the people there were so nice and friendly, and it was such a beautiful place that like this was shaping up to be really a tremendous day. And so Sofia and her husband, they are all smiles as they continue driving down this road. Sophia, she's looking out, taking in the sights and the sounds, and then at some point she just has this inclination to pull out her lipstick and, apply her lipstick. And so she reaches down and she grabs her purse, which she brought with her everywhere. She was a very organized person. And she opened it up and she's rifling through it and she finds her lipstick, and then she grabs her rear view mirror and she turns it and she uses it to apply the lipstick. And as she's doing this, she begins asking Julian, like, hey, what should we do for the rest of the day? Like, beyond this drive, what else should we do? And as she's sort of half looking at the mirror and half looking at Julian, she sees a blur of motion out in front of the car. And then she turns and she realizes there's someone in the intersection that they're going to hit. It's a guy on a motorcycle. And before she could say anything, Julian is swerving hard to the right to try to avoid this guy. It's like absolute madness. And then the motorcyclist, he tips over and he goes into a slide. And then Julian and Sophia, they ram off the road onto the sidewalk and smash into this huge pole. And pretty much right away, Sophia, after the car had come to a stop in front of this huge, metal pole, Sophia began patting herself down to sort of assess the damage, to make sure she was okay. And then she looked over at her husband, Julian, who was sort of doing the same thing, and they realized that, obviously despite the horribleness of this crash, that they were okay. But then their attention turned to the motorcyclist, because even though Julian didn't hit him, they narrowly missed him, he swerved away and they crashed into this pole, despite that, one of the last things Sophia saw before they swerved is the motorcyclist had tipped over and gone into the skids. They had no idea if he was okay or not. And so Sophia and Julian, they carefully climbed out of their pretty wrecked vehicle, and again, they stood and kind of checked to make sure they really were okay, because now they're standing for the first time, but, they're okay. And they walked a little ways, across the street to this other sort of side street where the motorcyclist had skidded off to. And right over there, he was standing. The man who was on the motorcycle, he was standing next to his bike. And, obviously his bike had some damage done to it, but the motorcyclist, he looked unhurt as well. So this was like an enormous, in some ways, stroke of luck. Obviously, it was bad to get into the accident, but all three of them appeared to be okay. And so Sophia and Julian, they walk over to the motorcyclist, and, the three of them were really amicable. I mean, the motorcyclist understood that, accidents happen, thank goodness nobody was hurt, and just for a few minutes.
How many times has he said,
It's the three of them just chatted, just talked.
Said it again.
About how lucky they really were here, and they exchanged information, so they could cover the damages if they needed to of the respective vehicles. And as they're just sitting there having this, relatively calm and just normal.
I noticed because I also see, and so a lot, so S-O. So during my previous job, and then I think for my submissions in the past 40 days, I've also been doing it, also been saying it.
Normal conversation here. Sophia looks over at Julian and she realizes, he was basically unhurt, but not entirely unhurt. He had this scratch on his face that was bleeding a fair amount that very likely was from the crash, and even though by no means is this life-threatening or anything like that, Sophia was not at the moment talking to the motorcyclist, and so she figured she would just go back over to the car and grab her purse, because she's very organized and she has something in that purse for every situation. She figured she very likely had a bandage or something she could use to clean up her husband's cut. And so she told her husband and the motorcyclist she was gonna go get her purse and go grab a bandage or something. She goes over to the car, which is still smashed up on the side of the road, of course, and there's a little bit of a crowd of people sort of relatively nearby, kind of assessing the scene. She makes her way around towards the passenger side because her purse was still in the car in the passenger seat. And as she was coming around, getting ready to reach through the open door to grab her purse, which was sitting right there on the seat, something happened. She got close enough to the car where like suddenly she felt this intense pain all through her body. And then it was like she couldn't even move, and she found herself falling towards the ground, looking up at the sky, and like her muscles are beginning to spasm. And the last thing she saw was her husband and the motorcyclist running over to her. And then to her horror, as she's laying there looking up at them, they too began to sort of seize up and spasm and fall to the ground right next to her. It would turn out that when Julian swerved to avoid that motorcyclist and crashed into that pole, neither he nor Sophia realized that that pole was actually connected to a power line that held up electrical lines carrying a huge amount of electrical voltage. And during the crash, a few of those lines from the pole had been knocked down to the ground, and they fell around Sophia and Julian's car. When the couple first got out of the vehicle, they sort of miraculously avoided stepping on those lines. And if they had just stayed over there, with the motorcyclist and just hadn't gone back to the vehicle, they would have been fine. But Sophia, whose purse always had exactly what she needed, was in the car, and she wanted to get it and get that bandage. And so when she went back, she stepped on one of those lines and she was electrocuted. And so she's on the ground, she can't move, and her husband and the motorcyclist, they see this happening, they hear it happening, and they run over unaware of the danger, and they too are hit by those electrical lines. They fall to the ground, and all three were electrocuted to death.
Oh, I feel bad for Slickering.
Weapons primed!
Ragnarok Zero Global.
Wow, Ragnarok has been going strong. Some of my schoolmates back in elementary played that. And there were times when I saw their cards for it, the prepaid cards.
On January 11th, 2018, around 10 a.m., 55-year-old Ray Wright sawed through a wooden board inside of his workshop, which was located about 20 minutes outside of Rockland, California. Now, Ray had only just begun his workday, but he was already covered in sawdust. However, he barely noticed, because this was just a normal part of his job as a carpenter, something he absolutely loved. He loved his career. In fact, Ray really just sort of loved everything about his life and sort of how it was going these days. And that had not always been the case. So about 6 years earlier, Ray was in a very different and much worse place in his life. He'd been recently divorced and had started drinking a lot, and he'd spiraled, further and further out of control until one night he'd gotten really drunk and then hopped behind the wheel, and he caused a terrible accident when he crashed head-on into another vehicle. Now, Ray was more or less okay after that crash, but he'd actually severely injured the people in the car that he had hit. And so Ray had been arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison, and he was ordered to pay a huge monetary settlement to the victims of this crash. And so really, this had been like the true rock bottom moment of Ray's life. But by the time Ray actually got out of jail, he was determined to really turn his life around and become a better person. He'd stopped drinking, and he had joined Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a very well-known support group that helps keep people sober. He'd started spending way more time with his 3 kids and also his brother Dean, and he'd been renting this particular workshop that he was in right now to revamp his carpentry business, Ray Wright Design. And then also, in addition to these specific behavioral changes, overall, Ray had made this huge effort to really shift his thinking about the way he approached life. He decided he was going to really try hard to just have a much more positive attitude in general and just try to be happier.
I'm finding that very hard to do. Okay, hold on. I don't know if these are flying. No, I mean, no negativity. I find it hard to remove negativity.
He believed it was more of a mindset, and he really was trying hard to stay in that positive, happy mindset. However, despite these wholesale changes in Ray's behavior and his mindset, which were definitely all good, the one thing he was up against that was very difficult to change, since coming out of prison, was his financial situation. I mean, he really just didn't make a whole lot of money. Despite working really hard as a carpenter now, he just didn't make a lot of money. And this really didn't just affect his life. It affected other people's lives as well. Because, he needed to make those huge settlement payments to the victims of the crash, which he intended to do. But so far, he had not made enough money to make those payments, and it was definitely stressing him out. He knew he needed to make those payments, but Ray was sort of determined that he would just continue to work really hard, continue to build up his business, continue to stay positive, stay happy, be a good person, and eventually he was sure to make these payments and everything would be okay. So in essence, Ray still had problems, but he was working really hard to just stay on the straight and narrow and do the right thing. Now, Ray blew some of the sawdust off the board that he had just cut, and he set it aside. And then, as he was about to start on the next thing, he realized one of the tools that he needed was out in his truck. So he walked through the shop's big warehouse-style doors that opened out onto a dirt driveway. So the workshop where Ray worked was in a fairly rural area with only one immediate neighbor who lived in a trailer right next door on the same property. And the person who owned the trailer was a woman named Katie. But, despite there only being Katie next door, there was still a fair amount of people just sort of coming and going around the place, like Katie's friends and Ray's clients. So the area was actually usually pretty lively. But this morning, as he stepped outside onto the driveway, it was pretty quiet. So Ray just made his way out to his truck and grabbed what he needed from inside, and then he turned and began walking back towards the shop. However, before he actually got to the shop, he heard footsteps on the driveway right behind him. 2 days later, Ray's brother Dean drove his car through some back roads as he made his way towards Ray's house in Rockland, California. Dean had just been to Ray's workshop, and now he was making the 20-minute drive back to Ray's home yet again. And the reason he was doing that is because Dean was really worried. He hadn't heard from his brother in 2 days, and neither had Ray's kids or any of Ray's friends. And this was very unusual. Dean, himself talked to Ray every single day. And he also knew that Ray was a very involved and responsive dad who would definitely not just disappear on his kids. And he was also definitely in touch with other friends. I mean, this was just very unusual for Ray. So over the past 48 hours, Dean had been increasingly getting more and more worried about Ray. He had been talking to anyone he could to try to figure out why his brother was just suddenly gone. He'd already gone to Ray's workshop and his house repeatedly, and he hadn't found Ray or any sign of Ray or any sign of where he might have gone. And also Ray's truck was nowhere to be found either. And that was actually particularly concerning because, deep down, Dean was worried that, despite the changes Ray had made in his life to be a better person and to do right by people, he was worried that, maybe Ray had fallen off the wagon and was drinking again. Maybe that's why he's gone. He's on a bender somewhere. Now, Dean really didn't want to face that reality. That would be devastating for so many reasons, not to mention, if Ray was off drinking somewhere, who knows what trouble he could be in. He could be in a lot of trouble or hurt or something. And so Dean, by this point, 48 hours into his brother's disappearance, he's just doing his best to kind of push down this growing concern that maybe that's what happened. And in fact, it was actually that sort of nagging fear that Dean had that had kept him from going to the police and reporting Ray missing. There was just this fear that if he did that, it would sort of expose Ray if he was, not doing what he was supposed to be doing. And so by this point, Dean had held off. Now, Dean parked his car outside of Ray's house again, and he got out, and, Ray's truck was not back yet. But Dean was determined that he would just go back inside and take another look around to see if maybe he had missed something. Maybe there was some clue as to where, Ray went or what he was up to. So Dean walked up to his brother's front door and he let himself inside, and immediately Dean stopped because he smelled something. It smelled like marijuana smoke inside the house, which was really odd. I mean, one, because the last time he was here, he definitely did not smell marijuana smoke, but more than that, Ray, his brother, had definitely once been a very heavy drinker. That was true. But he had always hated marijuana.
I can relate. You know, I was a very big alcoholic. But my rationale is that it's because it's legal. You know, here in the Philippines, marijuana is illegal. There's no such thing as medicinal marijuana here. Even without the THC, it's illegal. So, that's why I only use alcohol.
Like he did not smoke marijuana. And so Dean's standing in the doorway trying to make sense of this, when from the other side of the room, he hears somebody shouting at him to leave. And he sees on the other side of the room, this man has suddenly popped up who Dean did not know, who was looking right at him, basically gesturing for Dean to get out of the house. But Dean, he's sort of like, what's going on here? He looks at this guy and he's like, who are you? What are you doing in here? And the guy went very quickly from being sort of demanding to Dean to very spooked, turning and sprinting out the door, out of sight.
This is the most relaxing game in 2025.
Within the hour, a police officer with the Rockland Police Department pulled his cruiser up outside of a small one-story home in Rockland and parked. He saw a man waiting outside the garage, and as the officer got out of his car, the man rushed up and introduced himself as Dean, the person who had called 911. Dean explained to the officer that he had just seen an intruder here inside of his brother's home, and that his brother was also missing. And so the officer took down some notes, both about the intruder and also about, Dean's brother's absence and why him being gone for 2 days was really out of character. And so after the officer finished speaking to Dean, he went inside of Ray's house to take a look around and see if, there was any evidence left behind by the intruder to indicate who they were, or if there was any evidence about, where Ray was, and maybe that this intruder had something to do with Ray's absence. But once inside the home, the officer saw there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of mess or violence, so it didn't immediately seem like the intruder had robbed the place or gotten into some kind of physical fight with its owner. But still, the officer left the property and went back to his cruiser and called it in. And so over the next few days, the Rockland Police Department sort of led two parallel investigations. There was the investigation into this intruder inside of Ray's home, which really wasn't going very far. They had very little evidence. There was barely a description of this guy from Dean, who did not get a good look at him. And then the other investigation was into Ray's disappearance. And there was definitely some thinking that the intruder and Ray's disappearance could be connected, but as of right now, they didn't know. But with regards to Ray's disappearance, after the police had spoken to Ray's family and friends, they determined that no one had seen or spoken to him since January 11th. That was like the first sort of hard date and hard fact that they had. They also checked into Ray's bank account and phone activity, and they learned he hadn't used them since January 11th, when apparently he went missing. But beyond those details, as the weeks went on, really nothing else came in, not about the intruder or about Ray. Then, on January 21st, so 10 days after Ray went missing, the Rockland Police Department got their first, big new lead. And that was Ray's truck had been found. He was not in it. It had been found totally abandoned in this apartment complex that was not far from his workshop.
Intermission.
A couple of months later, on an afternoon in late March, Rockland Police Sergeant Zach Lewis sat at his desk at the station going over Ray's case file for what he felt like was the millionth time. So, since finding Ray's truck, basically no new leads had come in. And even that, the finding of Ray's truck really had not been the break that the police had really hoped it would be. The truck was basically in decent working condition. The only thing that really stood out was the plates had been taken off of it. But after they searched the truck extensively, they basically didn't find anything. Nothing that gave away what happened to Ray or where he was, or, whether or not this intruder had something to do with Ray. It just really didn't go anywhere. So, Sergeant Lewis was feeling pretty stuck when it came to this case. And so right now, he was just looking through the information they already had on this case to see if maybe he had missed something. However, as he began doing this, another officer ran through the station towards his desk, waving around some sheets of paper. And this officer ran right up to Lewis, and he slammed the papers down on his desk and explained that the California Highway Patrol had just sent a report over because they thought it might contain a lead in Ray's case. And here was the lead. And so Lewis is really excited. He grabs the document, and he sees it's a report. And it's about this van that had gotten in an accident at the end of January, a few miles south of Rockland in Sacramento. The driver of this van had been extremely drunk and was going over 100 miles an hour when he crashed. And somewhat miraculously, nobody got hurt, including the driver. And so the driver, he survives, and now he's facing all these charges of drunk driving and reckless driving. But the reason this report was sent over to Rockland was because the driver was a man named Victor Gray. That's what his license said. So after the crash, the police discovered that the license plate on the van that Victor had been driving was definitely the right license plate. However, the registration stickers that were on the license plates were not the right ones. Basically, Victor or somebody had taken stickers from some other vehicle and put them on this van's plates to give the impression that their vehicle, this van, was registered. But when they tracked those registration stickers, they discovered those stickers actually belonged to Ray Wright's abandoned truck.
Another ad, yeah? Mr. Bolan is pretty big.
Now, Rockland's police department knew this was a huge lead, and they could not screw it up. And so they wanted to make sure that they handled, whatever they did next exactly right, and they leveraged whatever resources they could get. So, over the next few weeks, Lewis and his team reached out to the FBI to help them process Victor's van and collect any potential evidence that was associated with Ray's disappearance. And a little over a month later, on May 8th, 2018, Lewis stood with a few of his other officers in a parking lot not far from Rockland, watching as a team of FBI agents searched Victor's van. Now, by this point, they had discovered that this van not only had Ray's registration stickers on it, but also inside of the van was a lot of Ray's stuff. They had found Ray's glasses, which were smashed. They had found Ray's cell phone, which was also smashed. They found his wallet. They found a hat that said Ray Wright design on it. And, critically, they found Ray's rain jacket.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna transfer my electric fan to my off-grid. I hope the PC doesn't shut down. Hold on. I had to reconnect the video. Maybe I can still learn how to whistle.
And it was covered in blood and partially charred, like it had been burned. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious to investigators that Ray was not just missing. He didn't just, go off the wagon and start drinking again and go disappear somewhere. No, he very likely had been killed. And very likely, this guy Victor Gray had something to do with it. But the problem was, there was no obvious connection between Victor Gray and Ray Wright. Like, they were total strangers. And when they tried to speak to Victor, to interrogate him, to try to get him to open up and explain if he had something to do with this, if he knew who Ray was, Victor was not talking. So that was a total dead end. And so now investigators were just hoping that, whatever evidence they found in this van, that once it was, sent off and analyzed, that hopefully that would sort of maybe begin to explain what actually happened here. Was this just a random robbery gone wrong? Victor was just robbing Ray and it got violent? Or was it something else? Or who knows what? They just didn't know. Now, Lewis watched as the FBI agents wrapped up the search of the van and, they began packing things up. So it was clear they had sort of pulled all the evidence they were going to pull. And, Sergeant Lewis and his team, they were about to leave when suddenly one of the FBI agents who was searching the front of the van in the front two seats, he began waving his arm like he had found something. And so Lewis and the others, they go running over and they look inside the van, and this agent is pointing down to like the center of the front of this van, basically near the center console. And there was this little space underneath the center console that apparently nobody had looked in yet. And inside of this little space was another cell phone. 5 months later, on an afternoon in October, Lewis pulled his cruiser into the dirt driveway right outside of Ray's workshop. But when Lewis and the other detective that he was with got out of their car, they ran past Ray's workshop and went to the trailer next door, where Lewis knew a woman named Katie Barnard lived. And so Lewis stood back as the other detective knocked on the door of the trailer, and a few seconds later, a very timid-looking woman, Katie, came to the door and she asked what was going on. And when Lewis explained to her why they were there, Katie went from looking timid to looking downright terrified. And she just began to shake, like she clearly understood why they were here. So they took her down to the station, and pretty much as soon as she was sitting inside of an interrogation room and they began asking her questions, Katie just completely broke and told them everything she knew. So ever since Ray got out of prison for that drunk driving accident, he really had been single-mindedly focused on trying to be a better person and not letting his rock bottom moment sort of ruin his life. And he'd done a great job doing that. He'd gotten sober, he'd begun, spending much more time with his family. He was like a very present father now. He was very well liked in the community. However, even though Ray, had good intentions here, the reality was he was just sort of focusing on rebuilding his own life. He wasn't really trying to help other people. Like his post-jail efforts were sort of all about him. And his self-improvement journey had really not been beneficial for everyone.
Well, I think the same can be said for me. There's a saying, at the end of the day, you can only clean up your own backyard. It's not expected of you to clean up to clean up for other people. I can barely manage my own life. What more if I tried to manage other people's? Now let's see where this goes.
Because Ray had really not truly atoned or done right by the person he had hurt the most. One of the victims of his drunk driving accident, a man named Bob Manor. Bob had been absolutely furious with Ray after the accident because the accident had severely injured him, Bob, to the point where Bob had a permanent limp. And then Ray had stopped making those court-mandated settlement payments to Bob. He was supposed to, but he just wasn't making them. And so Bob is like incensed. It's like, how dare you? You hurt me, you hurt my family, and you're not even paying for it. Like, jail isn't enough. And so for Bob, it became like an obsession that he really wanted to get his revenge on Ray. And it just so happened that Bob was not just a guy with a grudge. Bob was a very violent drug dealer as well. So this was a really big deal for him. So basically, after Ray got out of prison, Bob began obsessing over where Ray was. Like, he wanted to literally discover his address so he could physically go and take his revenge, but he couldn't find Ray. He could not find the information. No one was going to give it to him, for this reason exactly. And so he was just furious all the time. He wants to find Ray, but he has no way of knowing where he lives. Then, just by pure happenstance, Bob ends up dating a woman named Katie Barnard, who just so happens to live in the trailer right next door to the shop in Rockland, California, where Ray worked. And, Bob had no idea. He's just over visiting with Katie all the time. And one day he looks out the window, and who does he see walking out of the doors of that shop?
Hello, James.
Ray Wright.
Tired of brain rot games? Learn chess with me instead.
After that, and you have to understand that some of this stuff actually was never fully explained, Bob hired a man named Victor Gray to kidnap Ray for him, because he wasn't going to do it himself. He needed to catch Ray off guard.
My laundry's in the dryer, so lol. That's what I'm gonna do after the stream.
And so Victor Gray kidnaps Ray, and he apparently brings Ray to Bob so that Bob can exact his revenge on Ray. Now, we don't know exactly what happened once Bob potentially received Ray. We don't know if Ray ever actually made it to Bob, but we do know at some point Victor did kidnap Ray, and there was definitely revenge, on the agenda. But what Bob ultimately failed to do, that got him caught and got Victor caught and got this whole thing blown up, was he didn't pay Victor for the kidnapping. So the very thing that Bob was so mad about really was like, how dare Ray do this to me and then not pay me? Well, Bob did the same thing to Victor. He didn't pay him. And Victor was also a violent person. He's a convicted felon, and he didn't take that lightly. And so what did he do? He wrote a letter to Bob, basically being like, hey, I kidnapped this guy for you, and I handed him to you. Like, I handed him over, and you haven't paid me yet. And then he took pictures of this letter, and those pictures were on that phone that was found underneath the center console of Victor Gray's van. Those pictures of this letter are what connected Victor to Bob, and then the connection from Bob to Ray was already known. And then also critically, because Victor hadn't been paid by Bob for this kidnapping, he took the liberty of not only kidnapping Ray, but he went back and stole the registration stickers off of Ray's truck, and he put them on his own van. And then ultimately, it was that led to Victor getting caught and this whole, con being exposed. Now, we actually don't know specifically what happened to Ray Wright. All we know is that he definitely was kidnapped, and that Bob ordered the kidnapping, and that realistically, Bob is a pretty violent guy. Victor's a violent guy. There's blood found all over, Ray's stuff. It seemed pretty apparent that the revenge that was exacted on Ray involved his murder. But Ray's body was never found, and so we don't really know what happened to him. However, using overwhelming circumstantial evidence, both Bob Manor and Victor Gray were both convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and they were sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And
Oh wow, he's looks like there's a campfire. Yeah. Bro took pictures of his incriminating messages. he took pictures of.
Tonight, I'm going to share one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you go camping with the like button, wait until they're about to fall asleep, and then just pour a ton of itching powder in their only sleeping bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. Around 3:30 p.m. on October 25th, 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon drove his work truck along a paved road in the Medicine Bow National Forest, which is this huge nature preserve in southern Wyoming. Carl had taken off early from his job on an oil rig to go elk hunting in this preserve, and now he was heading towards this very specific area in the National Forest called McMarty Canyon that he had heard was really good for elk hunting. As Carl drove, he found himself looking around at the evergreen trees and the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and he just felt this total sense of calm come over him. He was a very rugged outdoorsman, and there was really nothing he loved more than spending time out in nature all alone. And so for a little while, he was just enjoying himself, driving along, until eventually the paved road he was on gave way to this long, rocky trail. And Carl, he didn't damage the truck he was driving, since it actually belonged to the company he worked for. So he wound up pulling over and getting out, and then he just grabbed all his stuff and continued walking on the trail by foot. The hike along this trail was not only pretty rocky and rough, but it was also predominantly uphill. And so it didn't take long before Carl was having trouble breathing. And not just because it was physically taxing, but also because when he was younger, he had tuberculosis, which had left his lungs really riddled with scar tissue that did make it harder to breathe.
You know, I'm lucky I've never been diagnosed with tuberculosis. You know, I actually live with someone who did. So they say, no, that their treatment is done.
Breathe, especially when he was exerting himself. But, you know, Carl continued on, and every few minutes he would just stop and bend over and catch his breath. But after about 30 minutes or so, he would hike to the point where the trees had come out, and then he found himself standing inside what looked like a big bowl in the earth. So this...
You know, the thought of that makes me wanna take another vitamin C tablet.
Was McMarty Canyon, where he was, intending to go for this elk hunt. And, the reason it sort of felt like a bowl is because it was mostly just flat with some shrubs and grass, a few trees, and these tall hills out on the sides, sort of giving this impression of a bowl. And so Carl, he sort of just stopped and took stock of the area. And wouldn't you know it, when he looked straight across the canyon, the bowl, he saw a group of just 5 elk grazing in the distance. Like, this was unbelievably lucky. Here they are, right away. And so Carl slowly began walking towards them, doing his best not to make any noise. And then when he was within shooting distance, he just stopped, raised his rifle, and he looked through his sights to aim at the first elk he saw, and then he pulled the trigger. But for some reason, when he pulled the trigger, the gun didn't go off. It didn't fire, or at least it didn't appear to. And certainly there wasn't any kickback. It just was like nothing happened. But then he saw something that just didn't make any logical sense.
Wow! See how big he is. Damn!
And at the same
Two unskippable ads.
time he's experiencing this just insane phenomenon, he felt this massive wave of vertigo, and then he just sort of felt himself falling, and then he blacked out. The next thing Carl knew, he felt himself being shaken back and forth. He sort of slowly began to blink his eyes, feeling very confused and disoriented. His head was pounding, it was clearly dark outside, and then he realized, sort of with horror, that somehow he was back inside of the work truck. But the surroundings outside of the truck definitely looked different. The truck was parked in a different spot than where he left it. He suddenly felt himself getting shaken again, and then he heard someone say his name. And he looked up, and in the darkness, he saw there were two men that he didn't recognize who were clearly shaking him, trying to get his attention. And they tried to ask him, like, what was going on? But Carl's mouth sort of felt down. And when he tried to speak, it's like the words came out garbled and nonsensical. And so at some point, these two men sort of gave up trying to talk to Carl, and they just lifted him up, pulled him out of the truck, and they carried him over to their vehicle. And Carl heard them say something about a hospital, and then before long, their car was driving off, and then Carl blacked out again. About 30 minutes later, around midnight on October 26th, so this is 8 hours after Carl first blacked out, his wife Marjorie rushed into a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, Wyoming. And inside, she saw Carl lying on the bed, hooked up to an IV, and there were a bunch of monitors with a nurse.
Okay, he's on IV. Anyway, right now in my mind, and I really want to become a premium tutor real quick, so that so that I wouldn't have to, so that either I don't have to work as much, or I can work as much but get so much more money. Wow.
Standing beside him, and she saw, her husband's eyes were open but clearly unfocused. And then as Marjorie is just standing there taking in the initial shock of what she's seeing, the nurse actually pointed at her, at Marjorie, and then asked Carl if he knew who she, his wife, who she was. But Carl, he turned and he looked at Marjorie, but he just kind of stared blankly and then shook his head and said no. So earlier that evening, Marjorie had been home for Carl to come back to his hunting trip. But when he hadn't shown up on time, she ultimately had called the sheriff's department and asked them to go to McMarty Canyon just to check on him. And so two deputies had gone out there and they found him, and he was unconscious in his truck. So those two deputies were the ones who obviously shook him awake and took him to the hospital. But interestingly, beyond the fact that the deputies had no idea what happened, they reported that his truck had been parked 3 miles away from the main road in this muddy bog, and strangely, there were no tire tracks leading to it. It was almost like it was just dropped in the bog with Carl inside of it. But, despite this weirdness, the deputies, and Marjorie for that matter, were not concerned about, the weirdness around the truck. They were worried about Carl, who's just laying here unconscious. And so they had rushed him to the hospital, and Marjorie had driven there as fast as she could. A doctor had already explained to Marjorie that her husband was, clearly very disoriented and seemed to be suffering from a case of amnesia. He couldn't even remember his own name, let alone, what had happened to him while he was out in that canyon before the deputies showed up and found him passed out in his truck. Doctors had given Carl x-rays and brain scans and run all kinds of tests on him, but not...
I've been seeing a lot of listings of like cars and trucks for sale. Knowing as people cannot afford to buy fuel anymore.
Not only did they not find any evidence of some sort of head injury, that likely would have caused amnesia, but they actually didn't find anything wrong with him at all. He seemed perfectly fine beyond him just showing up basically unconscious and disoriented. And so realistically, the staff told Marjorie that because they couldn't really find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. And so for now, Carl was just being kept in the hospital under constant observation. And so Marjorie just took a seat on the couch next to her husband's bed, sort of not even sure what to think of this whole situation. And she was about to ask the nurse a couple of questions But then suddenly, Carl sort of tensed up and began frantically looking around the room, like he really had something in mind that he was looking for. And then he began saying, like, "Where are my pills?" Marjorie had no idea what pills her husband was talking about. And it was clear the nurse also didn't know what he was talking about. And so Marjorie, she reached out and just tried to grab her husband's hand to try to calm him down. But the moment she did that, Carl sort of stopped what he was doing and he yanked his hand away and stared at her like she was a total stranger.
Itchy brushes ruining your makeup? Dream of pro-level perfection. Real Techniques brush set.
2 days later, Carl still could not remember what had happened to him when he had gone hunting. But he had recovered some basic memories, like his own name and also who his wife was. And so between that and the fact that realistically Carl did not have any signs of any physical injury, they ultimately, the hospital, discharged him and just sent him home with Marjorie and basically told her that he was probably fine, that he probably just needed a place to sort of recover all of his memories and get back. However, when the couple got back home, it very quickly became clear to Marjorie that Carl was not okay, and he was not getting better. For the most part, Carl was just unusually quiet at home, like uncharacteristically quiet. And then when he would speak, it often was in that frantic sort of nonsensical way that he had spoken in the hospital when he was, looking for his pills. And in fact, when he was home, he did continue to suddenly start looking for his pills. And then also he began telling Marjorie that, somebody had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to ask him, like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean your pills? What do you mean somebody took your elk? Like, what are you talking about? But Carl didn't even seem to know. He would have moments of recognizing that it's so crazy what he's saying, but he just didn't have the memories to be filled in. It was like Carl was just as confused by his own vague memories as his wife was. However, a few days after they got home from the hospital, Carl suddenly told his wife that he'd actually remembered something really specific about what had happened when he was hunting. Like a new memory had popped up in his mind. He told her that when he was in McMarty Canyon and he saw those elk and he raised his rifle and he pulled the trigger, he said there was no sound, there was no kickback, it was like nothing had happened. But then he said something happened that truly just didn't make logical sense. He said he realized the gun had fired, but it was like the world had slowed down and he could actually literally see the bullet leaving the rifle, but like in slow motion. Like this bullet is trickling out of the gun and slowly making its way, across the canyon, and he's staring at the bullet, and then the bullet seems to strike like invisible water. At which point the bullet actually stopped and almost like flipped inside out and sort of flattened and then fell to the ground. And then also as the flattened inside out bullet fell to the ground, Carl said he too fell to the ground and he blacked out. Now, when Marjorie heard this, her first thought was like, this is nonsense. This is not real. This is something maybe Carl's mind has created to fill in the gaps of his memory, because it's got to be really frustrating for him that he's got all these like fragments that he can't put together. And so maybe this is just his mind filling in the gaps with this really specific and weird imagery. But not long after hearing this story, Marjorie was doing the laundry and she was finally washing the clothes her husband had on when this whole thing happened out in the canyon. And when she reached into the pockets of his jacket to make sure they were empty before, washing the jacket, she felt something metallic.
I forgot to do that. But I'm sure that my pockets are empty in my laundry.
And she pulled out this round, like flat disc, this metal disc. And at first she just had no idea what it was. But then she thought about what her husband had said about the bullet from his rifle, flipping inside out, and flattening and falling to the ground. She couldn't help but feel like this metallic disc that she's holding in her hand that was in her husband's jacket looks an awful lot like a bullet that has been flipped inside out and flattened. Like she couldn't believe it. Not long after this discovery of the alleged bullet, Marjorie sat next to her husband on a couch inside of an office at the University of Wisconsin. They were both sitting across from a psychology professor named Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Now, Marjorie knew this meeting was sort of a long shot, but she was hopeful that, maybe they would learn something valuable. So by this point, Carl had not recovered any other memories from his hunting trip. But after, recovering the supposed flattened bullet in her husband's jacket, Marjorie became convinced that something truly strange had happened to her husband. She obviously knew something happened out in the canyon, but now it just seemed like I don't even have any theories for what could have happened, but something really weird must have happened. And so she and Carl were both very determined to try to figure out what happened. And so that's how they ended up in Dr. Sprinkle's office. Dr. Sprinkle was not your average psychologist. He was a really big believer in hypnosis. He practiced hypnosis. And specifically, he believed that hypnosis could potentially allow people to access repressed memories, which is exactly what Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle, and Carl for that matter, believed was going on with Carl, that he had experienced something that was being repressed. But it was in there, you just need to find a way to access it. So, that day in the professor's office, Marjorie stayed very quiet and just observed while Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to close his eyes, to relax his head down towards his chest, and just focus on his breathing, in and out, in and out. And after several minutes of this, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head back up. And Carl did, but when he looked up, his eyes were actually still closed. And at this point, Dr. Sprinkle asked Carl to tell him what happened on October 25th when he went elk hunting in McMarty Canyon. And Carl, with his eyes still shut, began to speak really fluently. And he began telling just the most insane story Marjorie, or Dr. Sprinkle for that matter, had ever heard. Carl said, again under hypnosis here, that after he had watched that bullet leave his rifle in slow motion and hit this invisible wall and flip inside out and fall to the ground, he said that he too had fallen basically at the same speed as this bullet onto the ground, and basically he passed out. But he only blacked out for like a second. And when he opened his eyes, he said he was still lying on the grass in the middle of this canyon. Except now, standing over him was this tall, dark figure that was wearing almost like a very tight-fitting bodysuit, almost like what a scuba diver would wear. And Carl said this figure was vaguely, human-shaped, but it had very yellowish skin and very small eyes and no ears and no lips. And there were two antennas sticking out of, its forehead. And one of its arms extended into this flat stump, but the other arm seemed to have almost like a prosthetic attachment at the end of it that almost looked like a power drill. And then, in perfect English, this figure sort of looked down at Carl and just said, "How are you?" And Carl said he was so stunned by this thing speaking to him in perfect English that Carl just sort of blurted out, "Oh, pretty good, pretty good." And the figure seemed satisfied with this answer, and it went on to quickly explain that its name was Ozo 1, and it came from a planet 163,000 light years away from Earth. And it said it had no intention of hurting Carl. In fact, it said it wanted to help Carl. Then, with the hand that sort of resembled a power drill, it reached into what looked like a pocket on its bodysuit, and it pulled out this small packet containing 4 pills. And it told Carl that these pills would heal him. And then this thing offered Carl one of these pills. And Carl, for reasons he couldn't explain, just immediately took the pill and swallowed it. And then after that, Carl said that also one asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl just said, "Sure."
Sure can. Hey, Barbie. Wanna go for a ride? Sure can.
So Ozo 1 helped Carl off the ground, and then as soon as Carl was standing back up again, he saw there was this cube-shaped vehicle not far away. And a split second later, Carl said he was somehow inside of this vehicle, along with Ozo 1, and also 2 other vaguely humanoid figures, and the 5 elk that he'd been out here hunting. They were behind this clear wall like a containment pen within the vehicle. And Carl was seated in a chair, as was Ozo 1 and the 2 other humanoids. They were all just sort of sitting there. Then Carl said he felt this powerful force push against his body, like the vehicle was moving so fast that it basically pushed him back into his seat. But less than a minute later, the vehicle just stopped, and Ozo 1 said, "We're home." At this point, Carl was just suddenly standing outside of the vehicle. And he said it felt very cold and the sky was jet black. And then around Carl, the landscape was very different from planet Earth. It was very rocky and desolate without any trees or grass or really any organic looking life anywhere. And then in front of Carl, he said he saw this massive metallic looking tower that sort of reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. And there was this light on the top of it that was actually so bright that Carl said when he looked at it, it sort of hurt his eyes. And so Ozzo 1 led Carl, the two other humanoid figures, and the elk to a door on the outside of this tower. And once they were standing outside of it, Carl said the door slid open, but instead of it sort of leading into the tower, it just led to what reminded Carl of the inside of a large elevator. And the whole group just got on board and began riding up. And then when this elevator of sorts came to a stop and the door opened again, Carl saw this small room with metal walls and a handful of what looked like platforms. Ozzo 1 led the elk onto one of those platforms and told Carl to get on one too. And so Carl just did as he was told and stood on one of these platforms. And then out of nowhere, some kind of high-tech device emerged from these metallic walls and began sort of circling around Carl. It went from his head all the way to his toes, basically like scanning him. Carl was vaguely aware of the same process taking place to the elk. And then when this scanner was done, it made a beeping sound, and then Ozzo 1 looked over at Carl and told him, well, the elk are what we needed, but you're not. So we're going to take you back to Earth now. And then Carl said the next thing he knew, he was just magically back in...
Bro, the alien didn't steal his elk.
...side of his work truck, like he had somehow been transported there instantaneously. And he was being shaken awake by those two sheriff's deputies. And so back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Marjorie is listening, just completely shocked by what her husband is saying, not even sure what to make of it. And then Dr. Sprinkle, at the end of Carl's story, when he got to the point where he's being shaken awake by the deputies, Dr. Sprinkle snapped his finger, and Carl kind of came to. He opened his eyes and sort of refocused, clearly out of hypnosis. And then they all just kind of sat there, like in total silence, really unsure what to say to each other. But as crazy as Carl's story sounded, there were several very strange facts about Carl's case that, up to this point, nobody had been able to explain. And the story that Carl told while under hypnosis technically accounted for all of them. The first fact that this story explained was that when Carl woke up in his work truck, like magically just appeared in his work truck, it was not just 3 miles away from the main road, it was actually 3 miles away from where he had originally parked it. And this truck was just sitting in a muddy bog with no tire tracks leading up to it. So it was just totally unclear how it got there. And so if you follow along with Carl's story, perhaps when he was transported back to Earth, they, this other creature and the other humanoids, maneuvered the truck with Carl in it into this bog. The second strange fact is that when Marjorie had ballistics experts analyze that flattened, presumed bullet that she had found in Carl's jacket,
What's a bullet?
They were just as baffled as she was. Like, they could not come up with any earthly explanation for how a bullet could be flattened and turned inside out. Like, this was not possible. And so again, if you follow Carl's story, perhaps this being is the one that flipped the bullet inside out. And the third and perhaps strangest fact is that when hospital doctors gave Carl x-rays, they found something that should have been medically impossible. All of the tuberculosis scar tissue in Carl's lungs that had plagued him for decades, that had made it so hard to be physical and exercise, they had somehow disappeared. It was as if someone or something had healed him. Despite how unbelievable Carl's story sounded, and despite the fact that hundreds of people have spent decades trying to disprove it, no one has ever found a better explanation for the moving truck, the impossible bullet, and Carl's disappearing scar tissue. Because of that, some researchers believe that Carl Higdon's account could be one of the most incredible alien abduction stories ever recorded. All right, thank you all so much.
Well, it was nice of them to get rid of his tuberculosis scar tissue. Ano, let's go all out. Frick. Banana. That's one banana. I see Wookie. Oh no, it's near 11 na. You know, it did pretty well for V5.
Locally, with multivitamins A, B, C, D, and E for daily energy and immunity.
So I can be at my 100% on and off the court. My daily vitamins.
Today's story is a classic scary cabin in the forest story, but with a very big plot twist at the end. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is looking to adopt a pet, tell them you just rescued a puppy and you'd love for them to adopt it. And when they say yes, go ahead and drop your puppy off, but don't tell them that your puppy is actually a hangry saltwater crocodile. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of October 17, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take... Today's story is a classic to our channel. This cabin where she was staying October 17, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late, it was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half-mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. You know, she was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived for a time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property.
Now, speaking of employment, I really hope that there's a development. I hope that they reviewed more of my submissions so that I can be closer to my goal of taking the final course exam.
A condo, and so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious, and so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and, there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk, but Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark, winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these two eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the two eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief, and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash. They turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt...
I've never had a dog, so I cannot really relate with stories where people have dogs.
relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room, and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table, and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you. But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream, and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone, and she was dialing 911, and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend. And so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night. From going out and seeing the mountain lion and then coming back in, hearing the sound, and now hearing the footsteps in the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go. And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police. And so the friend said, okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police. And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe.
Man, that looks really nice.
The Dyson Supersonic Drop. 32% smaller. 25%.
Ada let out.
Speaking of cakes, I kinda want a Black Forest cake or chocolate mousse. Either of those two. I love chocolate mousse.
A relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, hey, sorry, there is no issue here, don't call the police. But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point. Then her friend, who's still on the phone,
I've heard this one before, but I don't remember how it ends.
is screaming like, what's going on? What's going on? And all Ada could think to do was yell out, there's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them. And the friend is screaming, I'm gonna call the police. And then the line goes dead. And Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's going to do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around on her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up.
It's no secret that a lot of the stories I've covered over the years are about real people who have been victims of just unspeakable.
I also remember that story about the skydiving instructor who I think he cautioned the students fall using his own body. That's how I remember it.
The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least 2 gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. There were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground, not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground, not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing, and Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons. i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. There were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to take a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go. She must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication. But after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog, to clear her head, and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And
why would she do that? That's said to be the working people's drug. Like not to relax, but to be like hyper and stuff.
And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her, and then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection, but again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state, and so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her, but again, it's just her reflection, and so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person, and then didn't see anybody, and then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers, and then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind.
The last story.
Look what I found.
Before I became a professional, strange, dark, and mysterious storyteller, I served in the military. And during my time in the military, I had some pretty wild experiences, but what I remember most about my time in service was...
Okay, let's do... I don't think... Oh. I think I've already
One summer day, a
heard
man
this
named
one, but let's go.
John Randolph was hiking through a remote forest in Colorado when he began to smell something terrible. Intrigued, he followed the smell until it brought him to this clearing, and in the clearing, John saw what looked like an old campsite. Now, John is out in the middle of nowhere, and so the idea that somebody was camping out here in what looked like a long-term settlement was pretty bizarre to John. And so John walked into the clearing to see what was going on, and when he turned the corner and saw the ground in the middle of the campsite, he saw something that at first he couldn't even process. It was just so horrible, it just looked fake. But eventually he realized what he was looking at was real, at which point John turned around, sprinted out of there, and began screaming for help. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to go out to lunch with you, but once you get there, spend the entire time chewing as loudly as possible with your mouth wide open. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into this. On the freezing cold night of February 8th, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan sat around this roaring fire with a big group of men inside of this valley in western Colorado. The men around the fire, including Israel, were all gold prospectors, which meant they traveled the western United States looking for gold.
Yeah, I remember
But
this
over
one.
the past several weeks, this group of prospectors had been trapped in this valley because of all the terrible winter storms. They had these storms coming in that each time would dump up to 6 feet of snow. But on this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire, enjoying the flames and hearing people tell stories, one of Israel's friends, one of the other gold prospectors, whose name was Alfred Packer, he stood up and basically pitched the whole group as to why they should come with him and leave the valley right now. Basically, Alfred told the group that, the weather is starting to turn a bit, it's not as bad anymore, the snow's starting to melt, and Alfred said, I know a pathway out of here that will take us out of this valley in just 2 weeks, and it'll bring us right to Breckenridge, Colorado, which was an area that was known by prospectors for having lots and lots of gold. And so Alfred's basically telling them, this is a win-win. We can get out of here sooner, and we can get rich. After Alfred made this pitch, he sat back down, and everybody just stayed quiet for a second. And Israel, he kind of looked around and watched to see if anybody would take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't like Alfred. They said he was lazy and difficult. But Israel felt like that was really not the reason they did not like his friend. He believed the reason other people did not like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy, which meant he periodically had seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability for journeys like this, where, the whole group really needs to rely on everybody, and everybody needs to pull their own weight. And so they were kind of worried about a guy who, at any moment, could just become kind of useless because he was having a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy really didn't matter. He didn't feel like Alfred was some huge liability. He felt like Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. And so for him to stand up and make this pitch just kind of felt like in keeping with who he was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to naturally go with Alfred and do his big plan, but he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing out the pros and cons of, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire and he saw one of the men, this really big guy, was sitting there looking really serious and just shaking his head slowly back and forth, like, no, you guys can't be considering leaving early. And then the big guy stood up and held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically telling him, like, don't say another word. And then this guy, while still looking at Alfred, he said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And this big guy sat back down again, and everybody around the fire just sat there really tense for a few seconds in total silence. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different than the rest of the people sitting around this fire. His name was Uray, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabawatch band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Uray had actually saved the lives of everybody, Israel and Alfred included, who was sitting around this fire. Because a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up lost in this valley, which was the valley where Chief Yurei lived with his tribe, and he had found them stumbling around on the brink of death with all the snow coming down. And so Chief Yurei and his people brought the prospectors some food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river. And then Chief Yurei told them to stay put in this campsite and ride out the winter. And then in the springtime, when the snow melts, it'll be safe for you all to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were only thankful and just totally psyched that Chief Yurei had found them and given them this campsite. I mean, this was great. And so they had no problem agreeing to, wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being kind of trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried if they didn't leave soon, there'd be no more gold for them to mine. And for Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold, because he had told his family that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. And so he really couldn't go home empty-handed. He literally needed the gold in order to continue to survive and take care of his family. So when Alfred stood up and broke the kind of tense silence and said to Chief Yurei, thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early, and I just hope others will come with me. At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred, and Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. And so Israel said, you know what? I'll go with you as well. And then after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Yurei could tell he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. And so even though he felt like this was a terrible idea, he shifted his focus from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were going to go into. And so he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him, and then Chief Yurei drew a map in the dirt on the ground. And he told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that you have to follow the river out of here. It'll bring you to this mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range, and you cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You got to follow that river and go around the mountain range. And then once you do, on the other side, there will be an outpost where you can stop, get supplies, rest,
go around,
and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then after...
I bet they're gonna hike it. I don't remember.
After Chief Yurei had explained all this, he made sure to mark an X on his dirt map exactly where the outpost would be, and then Chief Yurei just turned around and walked over to his horse and rode away. And then shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for bed. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors who had not volunteered to go with them, who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward and said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go, using his horse. But at some point he would need to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. And so the men were very thankful about this. And so shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out the valley, they began to see off in the distance the huge jagged mountains of the San Juan Mountain Range. But they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path, because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. And as Israel trudged through the snow in a line of men, he held on to a coffee pot, a metal coffee pot that he kept hot coals inside of. This not only kept his hands warm, but also, if he ran out of matches, he could easily start a fire using the coals. It was an old trick he had learned. And so as he's clutching this magnificent warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him, and so he turned around and he saw it was Alfred. And he looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel was. And so without even thinking about it, Israel just handed off his warm coffee pot to Alfred. Alfred took it and clutched it and was obviously so thankful. Now, none of these gold prospectors had struck it rich. They were all basically poor. But of all these gold prospectors, Alfred really had the least of all of them. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. And also, Alfred was half the age of Israel. Alfred was 30 years old. And so Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid trying to find his way. Alfred had also confided in Israel that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions because he wanted to fight the slaveholding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they kicked Alfred out for his epilepsy. But that had not stopped Alfred from tattooing on his arm his battalion information and his name. And unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he misspelled his name when he gave it to the tattoo artist, and so when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D. And from that point on, that was his name. Nobody called him Alfred, they called him Alfred. And so this was kind of embarrassing for him. And then after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help. And so after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a flask with some alcohol in it, and he handed it to Israel, almost like a thank you for giving me this warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing back and forth the flask and the coffee pot. And then by late afternoon that day, when the snow was really starting to come down, the prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he had finally reached a point where he said, my horse can't go any farther, the weather's too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies and then he turned and headed back down the trail. And very likely, as these men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the same thought. Just gotta suck it up for 2 weeks to get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge. I will be Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. .com/Mr. Ballin. Two weeks would pass by, and Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Uray had pointed out, which was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was going to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by, and still they did not show up at the outpost, and they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving, it was snowing less, but within a couple of days of this group setting off on the trip, those winter storms came back with a vengeance and just dumped snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey was the men themselves, and then also Chief Uray and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay in the valley until spring. But even if Chief Uray and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in trouble, they would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley and basically couldn't do anything. And so in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 men were totally lost somewhere out in the wild, but nobody knew. But that would all change on April 16th, 1874, roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast in one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating...
Freaking hell, that reminds me I still haven't gotten any bacon.
And talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open, and these officials, they turn around, and they see standing in the doorway is this totally disheveled looking guy with long hair that's sticking up in the air, and a huge bushy beard, and in one hand he's got a rifle, and in the other hand he's got a metal coffee pot. And his eyes were darting like crazy side to side, and he was clearly in shock, and he was trying to speak, but he just couldn't. This man was Alfred. And it was obvious to the officials that this man is in dire need of help. And so without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door, got him some food, got him some water, and immediately Alfred's wolfing down the food as fast as he can until he began vomiting. at which point he apologized profusely and said, I've been starving out in the wild for weeks, and, it must have done something to my intestinal tract, it's probably damaged. But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over the ground. They were worried this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put in warm clothes. And then Alfred asked them, do you have any whiskey? I want to kind of warm my body up. And they said, no problem. They handed him some whiskey. And so Alfred threw a couple of shots back. And then after that, it was pretty obvious that Alfred had kind of relaxed a little bit. And then at that point, one of the officials asked Alfred, what happened to you? As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials that he had been with 5 men and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge, Colorado to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, the storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the trail they were on. And so the group decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range. The thing Chief Ure said, don't do that, do not go over the mountains. They decided to do that. But as they were traversing these treacherous mountains, it was clear that Alfred was just not keeping up with the group. And so unfortunately, they made the decision to leave Alfred behind to die. And he knew he was being abandoned to die. And so he had to watch as his 5 friends, disappeared into the snow. But amazingly, Alfred did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going, eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. And so at night, he was able to start fires. And then also at one point, he was so hungry that he cooked his leather shoes in the fire and ate them because, again, this guy is starving. And so really, he was on the brink of death when he randomly stumbled into this outpost and found this cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent. And Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive? And they would say, no, it's only you. We have not seen anybody else. Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away, mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It's been 2 months since they started that journey. The chances are just not good that they've survived. But even if these other men were not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search because he's the only one who knows where they could be. But Alfred was not healthy enough to go out in the wild and lead the search. And so for several weeks, Alfred just stayed in the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men.
An imbalanced immune system can leave you prone to sickness. You need an immunomodulator to bring back the balance.
On August 20th, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado, roughly in the area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible smell. And so John followed the smell until it brought him to this clearing, and then in the clearing was what looked like an old beat-up campsite. So, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who was in this campsite. But when he turned the corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze, because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in shock from what he's seen, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether, and the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically skeletons.
Oh no. Let me guess, they were eating each other one by one.
but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lively that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away, but he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies, and when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chest, looked surgical, like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away was the remains of a burned out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods, and he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there, but it had all the signs of someone living here for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together, and John realized what he had just stumbled on. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered, and the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This is like a cannibal camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy going to come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook, he sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out John, the illustrator, was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was left behind to die, those 5 other men carried on into the night up into the mountains, and then somebody attacked them, began killing them, and eating them. And that person was Alfred. That was why Alfred had survived for so long. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night, it was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even when he killed these 5 men. All we know is that based on the investigation, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered, but the 5th victim, who actually was Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was self-defense, and somebody else killed the other 4. It was kind of confusing. Despite those claims he had, the one thing Alfred never denied was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat.
Damn.
In fact, when they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But despite it being right there, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 92 years old, he was granted parole, and right away Alfred became a vegetarian and then died a few years later. From the 1800s all the way through the 1900s, Bodmin's St. Lawrence Hospital was one of the largest running asylums in all of England. But in 2002, it was permanently...
One last story.
Never give up on your dreams, no matter how many times you fail. One Japanese man took this message to heart. The only issue was, his dream was to be a brain surgeon. And no matter how hard he tried, he just sucked at it. But that didn't stop him. He would never give up. No matter how many procedures he screwed up, no matter how many lives he ruined, he would be a surgeon. It's July 2019, and Matsui Hiroki has just been hired by Ako City Hospital, the only hospital in, well, Ako City. Ako is one of those small Japanese towns with not a lot going on. The biggest landmarks are the train station, a shrine, and the ruins of an old castle. Matsui had been recruited by Dr. Chiba, Ako's top neurosurgeon, who was impressed by his experience at Kyoto Memorial, a big hospital. While Matsui had technically never performed a surgery, Dr. Chiba was convinced that under his mentorship, Matsui could be a huge asset for his struggling hospital. Matsui, with cutting-edge techniques and 200 surgeries under his belt, as an assistant surgeon that is, leaves such a strong impression on Chiba that he immediately puts Matsui on his neurosurgery team. In his first week, Matsui is going to be the chief surgeon on a major operation, a brain tumor removal on a 30-year-old patient. Not only is the surgery a complete success, but Matsui completes it in record time. In the operating room, he insists that the surgical staff literally give him a round of applause for his achievement. Dr. Chiba is extremely impressed, but in the post-operative review, Chiba realizes the reason Matsui finished the procedure so quickly is because he only removed 20% of the tumor. Now, Chiba has to perform a second surgery just to clean up Matsui's mess, and fortunately the patient does go on to make a full recovery. For this story, that counts as a happy ending. Now, did Matsui learn anything from this mistake?
Nope.
No, actually he didn't even show up to the second operation. He apparently had something more important to do than brain surgery. This should have been Dr. Chiba's first hint that something was wrong, but instead, he decides to cut Matsui some slack. Starting any new job is hard, especially when that job is, again, brain surgery. Dr. Chiba had a good feeling about Matsui, and he knew everything was going to work out in the end. 2 months later, Matsui seems to be getting the hang of things, so it was time for another surgery. This time, Matsui would prove himself. Matsui's first case upon his return is an 83-year-old man presenting with paralysis below the waist. Matsui's diagnosis is hydrocephalus. Basically, the guy's got fluid in his brain. Is this diagnosis backed up by any tests? No, but it's fine. Just trust him, bro.
Lol.
Matsui tells the patient that surgery is going to fix all his problems and get him walking again. Okay, so the old man still can't walk after the surgery. Not only that, but now he can't even swallow, meaning that Matsui has done some serious damage. But Matsui just shrugs. I mean, it's not his fault, and there's nothing anyone
OMG, such malpractice
could have done. That was his new catchphrase. By this point, Dr. Chiba was starting to get a little, concerned. He conducts a review of Matsui's cases, and what he finds shocks him. For one, Matsui was finding, or more like scouting, his surgical prospects during outpatient visits. Matsui's basically a used car salesman for brain surgeries. He'd diagnose the patients based more on gut feel than tests or evidence, sell them on the idea that his surgery would solve all of their issues, and then schedule them into the OR as soon as possible. None of that boring pharmacology stuff. Matsui just wanted to play Operation. But Chiba isn't a confrontational guy, and he did, after all, hire Matsui, so he decides to just wait and see for now. A couple days later, Matsui treats a 43-year-old man with chronic nerve pain in his face. Matsui drills a small hole in the patient's skull to relieve pressure on the compressed nerve. Sounds simple, right? Nope, the patient wakes up from surgery and discovers he's now deaf on the drilled side. Once again, Matsui's response is, it wasn't the surgery. There's nothing anyone could have done. That same week, Matsui is called in to do a procedure called a clot retrieval on a 90-year-old stroke victim, Mrs. Yamada. This procedure requires him to insert a device called a catheter into the patient's cerebral artery. Matsui performs the surgery in a totally carefree manner, guiding the catheter like he's playing Subway Surfers. Mrs. Yamada suffers an intracranial bleed during the surgery and falls into a coma. Unfortunately, Mrs. Yamada would never wake up from this coma. A month later, she passed away. What's Matsui's reaction to this outcome? You guessed it, there was nothing anyone could have done. Matsui has now made 3 serious surgical errors in 8 days. For some baffling reason, Dr. Chiba still does not suspend his operating privileges. October 3rd, Matsui is scheduled to perform a cervical laminoplasty on Mrs. Saito, a 75-year-old woman with cervical spinal canal stenosis. In English, Matsui is going to widen her spinal canal with a drill. It sounds terrifying, but this is a fairly common and safe procedure. That is, until you remember this is Matsui we're talking about.
Imagine redness calmed in seconds. Skin 1004 centellipads. Fast calming and hydration. Lazada 100% authenticity guaranteed. Free shipping included. Tap the link now.
Scara! It's my husband.
In the hospital's medical safety office, receives a call on the
But he
emergency
doesn't know
line.
he's my
She
husband.
rushes to the operating room and finds Matsui in a visible state of shock. He had pierced the vertebrae at the neck, drilling directly into the spinal cord and completely severing it. The result was complete and irreversible paralysis from the neck down. He had turned Mrs. Saito into a quadriplegic. Now, would this be the thing that makes Matsui finally take responsibility for his actions? No, of course not. Instead, he desperately lashes out at everyone around him, going as far as asking Dr. Chiba to take the fall for him. And when that doesn't work, Matsui goes to his patient, or I guess his victim at this point, begging her to let him operate again to fix the issue. Yes, his solution was more surgery. She tells him to f off, so Matsui has her sent to a rehabilitation facility under the pretext that she has dementia. This is the caliber of person we're talking about here. A doctor who will paralyze you, completely ruin your life, and then ship you off to some warehouse to cover up his own tracks. Just as a reminder, all of this occurred within the span of 1 month. In the time it takes for your Amazon Prime trial to expire, Matsui has killed or permanently injured 4 people. And he wasn't about to stop. We'll get to that. But first, we have something much more important to talk about. The sponsor of today's video, War Thunder. War Thunder is the ultimate vehicle combat game that lets you take control of anything from biplanes and armored cars from the 1920s to modern fighters and main battle tanks, with over 20 multiple premium vehicles. So it was clear by now that Matsui was not a good surgeon. Even from the beginning, there were a bunch of red flags that Dr. Chiba had just missed, or more likely, ignored. Like, it turns out that even before hiring him, the head of the hospital, Dr. Fuji, had actually gone to Kyoto to discuss Matsui with his former bosses. They warned Fuji that Matsui was incapable of performing even basic medical procedures, like staunching blood. Not only that, everyone at Kyoto absolutely despised him and thought he was a pain in the ass. This was not a surprise to the staff at Akko. I mean, Matsui's a complete mess there, too. He frequently sneezes right over patients in the middle of surgery. His desk is a pig pen. It's covered in papers, food, and even his own socks. One time, he was MIA for a surgery, and the staff found him in the parking lot showing off his new car. So why didn't anyone at Akko City Hospital stop him? Well, for some mysterious reason, Dr. Chiba simply refused to give up on Matsui. Despite everything he's witnessed, despite everything Matsui screwed up, Chiba still clung to the delusion that Matsui could be an asset to the hospital. And not to mention, it was hard to get any surgeon to work in Akko, even a bad one. But Chiba wasn't the only one who dropped the ball here. Akko Hospital actually has a medical safety office formed specifically to prevent these kind of incidents. But it was an open secret that the department was a joke. Medical safety positions here are treated like cushy landing spots for retirement age employees, and the department is staffed by former nurses, led by Kimura. While their job is ostensibly to prevent accidental injuries, in reality they have a vested interest in covering up any incidents and protecting the hospital's reputation. In the end, it's actually the clinical technicians who sound the alarm on Matsui. In December, a radiology technician files a complaint against him for exposing a patient to a dangerous dose of radiation during an operation. Allegedly, multiple doctors have to drag Matsui out of the operating room as he's shouting, "I'm a surgeon! He's my patient!" After this incident, more and more technicians, and now clinical engineers, are refusing to work with Matsui, forcing Dr. Chiba to second all of his surgeries. December, Matsui performs a cervical discectomy to treat an 89-year-old man's herniated disc. After the surgery, the patient completely loses the ability to swallow. January, Matsui installs a shunt in a patient's skull. A piece of the shunt breaks through the jugular vein and ends up in the patient's heart. Dr. Chiba has to perform a revision surgery to fix Matsui's mistake again. At a New Year's party, Dr. Chiba runs across Dr. Sugihara, Matsui's former mentor at Shiga Hospital. When Matsui's name comes up, Sugihara's face goes pale. "Don't you know?" he whispers. "Matsui was expelled from our neurosurgery department." Sugihara goes on to call Matsui a catastrophic neurosurgeon who treats surgery like cutting up a radish. Sugihara tells Chiba that he's actually being sued for a surgery where Matsui was his assistant. He says, "You need to get rid of him." But it's too late for Dr. Chiba. He's now completely paralyzed, a prisoner of Matsui's insane rampage. No matter what Matsui did, all Chiba could do was follow in his wake and try to pick up the pieces. January 22nd. Dr. Chiba's heart sinks when he learns that Matsui has pressured yet another patient into surgery. The patient is 74-year-old Mrs. Fukunaga, and the procedure is a laminoplasty, the same one that left Mrs. Saito paralyzed from the neck down 3 months ago. Please let Matsui learn from his mistakes, Chiba pleads. Knowing that Matsui's grasp of anatomy is tenuous at best, Chiba tries to tell Matsui exactly what he needs to do. "Drill here," Chiba says, pointing at a vertebrae. Matsui drills, but the patient starts bleeding, constantly bleeding. He calls for more suction, but it's no use. Blood is now seeping from everywhere. Matsui is confronted by his greatest weakness, the inability to staunch bleeding, the one skill that every surgeon needs. The operating field is a sea of red as sweat rolls down his face. Matsui is in complete despair. He knows he has to continue the surgery.
He was granted parole, and right away Alfred became
I know what
vegetarian,
happened. What the
and then-
frick?
Matsui is confronted by his greatest weakness, the inability to staunch bleeding, the one skill that every surgeon needs. The operating field is a sea of red as sweat rolls down his face. Matsui is in complete despair. He knows he has to continue the surgery, so the only thing he can do is pick a spot and drill. A sickening silence. Even Matsui can feel that something is wrong, because his drill hits something that is definitely not bone. Dr. Chiba looks over and lets out a little whimper. Matsui has made the exact same mistake as last time. He's drilled into the spinal cord, and this time the damage is so bad that the patient's nerves look like a ball of yarn. There's actually video footage of this surgery. Yes, it really looks like a ball of yarn, and no, you really don't want to watch it. Trust me. The footage ends with Matsui literally just stuffing the nerves back into the hole he drilled and hoping for the best. This was Matsui's most serious surgical error yet, and it would later come back to haunt him, but for now, all he got was a slap on the wrist. A month later, he was back at it. He was going to perform another brain tumor removal, the very first procedure he failed at Akko. Last time, Matsui had left 80% of the tumor intact, but this time he had a plan. See, Matsui treated surgery like a carnival game. Threw the ball too hard last time? Well, switch to underhand. Left most of the tumor intact? This time I'll keep cutting until I cut out so much healthy and functional brain tissue that it leaves the patient in a persistent vegetative state with zero hope of recovery.
Damn!
It's only been 8 months since Matsui started working at Akko Hospital.
I'm just overreacting.
And he's been involved in as many serious medical errors. In 2 of the 8 cases, the patient had lost their life. This was the last straw. The hospital's entire surgical staff now straight up refuses to work with Matsui. As the chief clinical technician put it, "I don't want to be involved in another murder." The medical safety office calls the director of the hospital, Fuji, in a panic. Only now they're beginning to realize the severity of the situation and how much trouble they're in when the public finds out. Kimura, Fuji, and Chiba all start arguing and pointing fingers at each other, but there's one thing they agree on. Matsui is to immediately be banned from all surgeries. The nightmare is over. Or at least, that's what they thought. But the story is about to get truly, truly insane. You see, Matsui was going to fight this. His dream was to be a surgeon, and he would never give up. No matter what. Matsui has essentially barricaded himself in one of the hospital's conference rooms. It's been weeks since he's seen any patients, and at this point, he gives all of his instructions to nurses via text. Akko Hospital has no right to take away my surgical privileges, he angrily mutters to himself. I've done absolutely nothing wrong. Therefore, the only logical explanation is that someone at the hospital was out to get Matsui, and that person was obviously Dr. Chiba. Yes, the person who bent over backwards for him the entire time, cleaning up all of his messes, was out to get him. Matsui begins plotting his revenge. His first act is to author a report detailing every single surgical error he's made, or rather, every single surgical error he hasn't made. Matsui's report is a treasure trove of fake data and blatant lies. You see, none of his patients ever suffered any side effects, and if they did, it was in no way his fault. Most critically, Matsui places the blame for all of his errors squarely on the head of Dr. Chiba, claiming that it was all because of his lack of supervision, or in some cases, even claiming that it was Dr. Chiba actually holding the knife. Most surprisingly, perhaps out of shame or sheer resignation, Dr. Chiba actually signs off on the report. Just like that, Matsui is absolved of all responsibility by the Medical Safety Office. But it's a hollow victory, because the hospital still won't lift his surgery ban. So he needs to get creative. Matsui realizes that even under a surgery ban, he can still operate if he happens to be the only doctor around when a surgery occurs. One night, Dr. Chiba receives a call from the hospital. The doctor on the line is in a complete panic. Matsui was on call that night and took a patient into the OR for an emergency catheter surgery. Like a demon who's been sealed away, Matsui has escaped his prison to wreak havoc. Dr. Chiba rushes to the hospital and stops the surgery immediately, but the patient's condition still deteriorates the next day. Of course, this incident only intensifies Matsui's hatred for Dr. Chiba. After everything horrible Matsui's done so far, what he does next is so revolting, so deranged that it can only be described as pure evil. You see, Matsui decides that the best way to get back at Dr. Chiba is to drag him down to his own level. Since Matsui's banned from surgery, he follows Chiba into surgeries as his assistant, then spends the entire procedure berating Chiba and telling him that he could do better. Yeah, it's not enough that Matsui's the worst surgeon alive, he's now heckling other legitimate surgeons. Eventually, Chiba relents and gives Matsui the knife, because of course he does, and Matsui gives the patient a lung contusion, because of course he does. For once, Dr. Chiba learns from his mistakes and doesn't give Matsui the knife anymore. So what does Matsui do? He gives up and reflects on his mistakes. No, just kidding, of course he doesn't. Instead, he literally barges into one of Dr. Chiba's surgeries and tries to knock the drill out of his hand so that it'll look like Dr. Chiba injured his patient. Let me repeat that. A surgeon went into an operating room in order to sabotage a surgery.
Are you trying to extract ancient DNA the wrong way? Are your tools lacking what it takes to get the job done? Are you at your wit's end and just trying anything at this point? Stop! Introducing Get That Ancient DNA the Right Way with Dr. Beth. The quick and easy way to get that ancient DNA.
The first step is to find the thing that you want to
But somehow it gets even worse. Somehow Matsui's not done. Not satisfied with just ruining Dr. Chiba's career, Matsui decides to sue the hospital for taking away his surgery privileges and tries to get Dr. Chiba arrested. Remember that completely fake report Matsui wrote? Using that report, Matsui claims to be a whistleblower with evidence that Dr. Chiba was not only guilty of criminal malpractice, but that Chiba and the hospital were framing him to cover up Chiba's crimes. He goes as far as to claim that Dr. Chiba had tried to murder him by pushing him down a flight of stairs. None of this was true, of course, but due to the hospital's appeasement and cover-up of his crimes, the evidence was actually on his side. The police have no choice but to open an investigation and place Dr. Chiba under arrest. Finally, after being interrogated for hours by the police, Dr. Chiba has reached his breaking point. He releases every record he has, every single email from Matsui where he's crying, throwing a tantrum, begging Dr. Chiba to take the blame, and trying to put the fault on someone. Anyone else. Matsui is utterly humiliated by this and withdraws his lawsuit, but he has one last trick up his sleeve. He goes straight to the hospital's director, Dr. Fuji, and says, "Maybe I don't have enough to bring down your hospital, but I can make everyone here's life miserable. Don't say a word about what I've done here to anyone. If you do that, you'll never see me again." Fuji is terrified, and seeing an opportunity to finally be rid of Matsui, he makes another deal with the devil. Matsui resigns. At this point, it seems like Matsui has won. Despite being the worst doctor alive, despite ruining countless lives and throwing everyone who tried to help him under the bus to save his own ass, he's gotten away scot-free. And that would be the case if he had just retired then and there. But remember, Matsui is a surgery junkie. He's a medical terrorist, and his only purpose in life is to spread malpractice and misery to as many people as he can. And that misery was finally about to catch up with him. Matsui happily starts his new job at Suita Tokushukai Hospital, where he works in the emergency department. He's no longer a neurosurgeon, thankfully, but he plans to take a specialist exam for catheter surgeries in a few months and get right back on the saddle. Remember, this is the procedure that he botched so badly that he killed a 90-year-old patient at Akko. Within a week of Matsui arriving, something strange and incredible happens at the hospital. Everyone notices that Matsui doesn't know how to practice medicine. Then again, it's kind of hard not to notice when you're holding a patient's lips and Matsui keeps accidentally pricking your fingers with the needle instead of stitching the patient's mouth together. Yes, this actually happened. Just for fun, let's go over a few of the numerous errors Matsui made during this time. He sent a woman with a broken jaw home without treatment, attempted to administer an IV of adrenaline to a patient not in cardiac arrest before the staff stopped him, left used syringes contaminated with hepatitis C on a patient's bed, and forgot to give a 90-year-old man dialysis for 3 days, leading to his unfortunate death. These are excerpts from 50 pages of incident reports filed against Matsui. Yeah, like I've mentioned, by some miracle, the staff at Suita don't follow the Akko playbook and sweep these accidents under the rug. In fact, Matsui quickly becomes a joke at Suita and eventually has to resign. After leaving Akko, he would never find steady employment again, just bouncing from hospital to hospital. Matsui also ends up failing the catheter exam he was practicing for, not just because he was incompetent, but because it turns out, surprise, surprise, he fabricated dozens of surgical records. Yeah, it turns out those 200 surgeries as an assistant was a blatant lie, and he had been in 30 to 40 at most. And his troubles didn't end there. Remember how I said Akko is a small town? Well, in small towns, people talk, and Akko Hospital had gained a local reputation as the hospital where people get worse, not better. Yeah, that's pretty fair. Naturally, the press started asking questions, and the spattering stream of reports quickly became a waterfall. The hospital's administration tried their best to quash these reports and deny any wrongdoing, but that ended as the lawsuits came in. It all ended with the hospital losing their neurosurgery accreditation for all of this mishandling of post-incident safety reviews. The walls were closing in around Matsui now. Everywhere he went, people recognized him as that really terrible doctor from Akko. The NHK even made a documentary about the string of medical incidents at Akko Hospital, where he was identified in all but name. The final nail in the coffin came with a civil suit filed by Mrs. Fukunaga, the patient who Matsui left paralyzed below the waist with his drill. Mrs. Fukunaga and her family made several media appearances, telling interviewers that Matsui's surgery left her incontinent and in constant pain. Finally, on December 29, 2024, 5 years after his reign of terror at Akko Hospital, Matsui Hiroki was indicted and arrested for professional negligence causing injury. They finally got him. As Matsui was awaiting trial, people began asking some difficult questions and getting shocking answers. Like, how could something like this, or someone like this, terrorize the healthcare system and get away with it for so long, especially in a highly developed country like Japan? Many experts believe that there's a crisis going on at rural hospitals there, where they can't attract talent and struggle just to keep the lights on. This was definitely the case at Akko Hospital. I mean, according to whistleblowers, administrators were booking as many surgeries as they could and desperately cutting costs just to stay out of the red. Other experts point to Japan's lax medical safety laws, which don't penalize surgeons or suspend their medical licenses based on the number of accidents they've caused. In fairness, it can be very difficult to determine whether a surgeon is negligent or incompetent, because every case is so different and every procedure has a different level of risk. Also, surgeries are done by a team of doctors, nurses, and technicians, so it can be hard to attribute an accident to a single person's mistake. I mean, sometimes it's even hard to determine whether a surgery was a success or not, so it can take years and dozens of surgeries for patterns of error statistics to appear. Part of what made Matsui so hard to catch was that he wasn't making massive, isolated errors. He was, by all accounts, just really, really bad at surgery. But the most troubling part of this story isn't the systemic problems in Japanese healthcare, and it's not even the deranged monster putting his ego above the lives of innocent people. Evil exists, but it's ultimately an aberration. The vast majority of doctors are people we can and should trust. No, the most disturbing thing about today's story is that so many of those competent, experienced doctors who frankly had every motivation to speak out just stood by and did nothing, over and over again. But there's something very strange about this story. If you've heard about this case from the media, you might have noticed that there's a huge part of the story I skipped. It's because I can't cover it on YouTube. So I've explained the specifics in the follow-up video, but first, a massive thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to check out War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or on mobile, and use my link in the description to register. If you're new or haven't played in 6 months, you'll also get a bonus pack across PC and console with multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more. Anyways, I've told the rest of the story in the part 2 video, which is available for free in the description. It's on Patreon, but you don't have to sign up to watch it. Speaking of patrons, thank you so much to all of my patrons for supporting me and making my videos possible in the first place. And finally, thank you so much to Eli and Liv for doing the art in this video. It seriously would not have been possible without them. Thank you guys so much. See you guys next time, and I love you. Bye-bye.
Okay. I'm rolling to.
Skyflakes, maingat at matagal ang paggawa.
Bye-bye, YouTube. See ya. Take care now.